She was born a Princess of Prussia. Married into the Dutch House of Orange, she rose to power as the woman who ruled when her husband could not. But the same strength that saved her dynasty turned her into a target of hatred. Humiliated, exiled, and forgotten, Wilhelmine of Prussia spent her final years consumed by despair. At 68, she did not die of illness, but of a sorrow too heavy to bear. Berlin, 1751. The city pulsed with the rhythm of soldiers' boots and the sharp ring of iron drills. This was Prussia, an emerging military power, a kingdom of discipline and iron will. And within its royal palace, a child was born who carried the weight of dynasties before she could even walk. Her name, Wilhelmine of Prussia. She was the daughter of Frederick William II and Princess Louisa Amalia of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. To the outside world, her birth was just another link in the chain of royal blood, but to those who knew the ways of monarchies, it was more than that. Every princess was a promise. Every birth was a political weapon waiting to be drawn. Wilhelmine's cradle was not lined only with silks. It was lined with expectation. She belonged, from the first breath, not to herself, but to the chessboard of Europe. The Prussian court was unlike others. It did not glitter with the endless entertainments of Versailles, nor did it soften itself with the music of Vienna. Prussia was steel. It was obedience. It was calculation. Children in the royal household were taught not merely to smile and dance, but to embody the discipline of the state. And so Wilhelmine grew up in a world where warmth was rationed, where affection was rare, and where the measure of her worth lay in how well she could serve her dynasty. Her tutors trained her in languages, music, and etiquette. But beneath every lesson ran the unspoken message: you will marry where we tell you. You will live as we command. The House of Hohenzollern had no patience for sentiment. Girls were bargaining chips. Their hands in marriage could mean alliances, armies, and territories. Wilhelmine learned this early. At dinners, she watched ambassadors whisper, watched men in uniform trade glances with ministers, watched her father weigh every relationship in terms of what it could buy him on the battlefield. It was no secret. Her life would not be her own. As she entered her teenage years, suitors' names began to float across the corridors. Not lovers, never lovers, but potential allies: Austria, Britain, the Netherlands. Each name was weighed and measured, not for compatibility of hearts, but for compatibility of cannons. Wilhelmine, like many royal daughters before her, understood the rules. She may have dreamt of tenderness, of a partner who saw her as more than a tool. But such thoughts had to be buried. She wore the mask of duty, as every princess must. Prussia itself was changing during her youth. Frederick the Great, the towering uncle whose shadow stretched across Europe, had shown the world that a small kingdom could be mighty if its discipline was absolute. Victories on battlefields had painted Prussia's name in blood and steel. Wilhelmine grew up hearing of those victories, the tales of generals and wars retold like scripture. In such an environment, how could she imagine a life of softness? She was, after all, a daughter of iron. Yet, behind the rigidity of court life, Wilhelmine possessed a sharpness of mind that would one day set her apart. Observers later would recall her as intelligent, decisive, even commanding. These qualities, admired in men, would become daggers against her when displayed by a woman. But as a child, they went unnoticed, hidden beneath the layers of formality and restraint. She loved books. She loved to listen to the sounds of Berlin, the clatter of carts, the hum of soldiers' marches, the distant bells. She loved the small escapes that life permitted. But even then, those escapes were fleeting. A princess's hours were not her own. Every morning was scheduled, every gesture observed, every word noted. In this environment, her personality sharpened like a blade in a forge. Wilhelmine learned resilience not through comfort, but through pressure. And pressure would become the motif of her life. Her destiny took clearer shape as the political winds of Europe shifted. The Dutch Republic, though wealthy, was unstable. The House of Orange, ruling in fragile balance, sought strong allies. And in Prussia, whispers began. Perhaps this Prussian princess could cement a bond. The decision was not hers. It never was. By the time she was 16, her future had been sealed. In 1767, she was betrothed to William of Orange, the stadtholder's heir. For Prussia, it was strategy. For the Netherlands, it was reassurance. For Wilhelmine, it was a chain. The announcement was made with pomp. Courtiers celebrated, ministers toasted, songs were composed. And Wilhelmine smiled, as she was expected to smile, though she knew that behind the celebration lay the quiet truth. She was leaving home forever. Berlin had forged her, but it would no longer be hers. The day of her departure, she stepped into the ceremonial carriage dressed in jewels that glinted like cold stars. Crowds gathered. They cheered for alliances, not for her happiness. She sat rigid, looking out at the city she had known since birth, realizing with each turn of the wheels that the streets of Berlin would fade behind her. Her childhood was over. Her identity as Wilhelmine of Prussia would soon dissolve into Wilhelmine, Princess of Orange. The journey ahead was not just across distance, but across fate itself. She was heading into a marriage arranged for politics, into a country suspicious of outsiders, into a life where her strength would bring her both influence and ruin. She was only 16, and the chains had already begun to tighten. The year was 1767. Across Europe, courts exchanged letters, sealed with wax and guarded by couriers who rode through rain and dust. Those letters carried no poetry, no secrets of love. They carried negotiations. They carried the fate of a 16-year-old girl. Her name appeared in every draft, Wilhelmine of Prussia. The match had been decided. She was to marry William V of Orange, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. It was not a love story. It was a contract. For the House of Orange, this union promised survival. Their position in the Dutch Republic was precarious. They needed a powerful ally. Prussia, disciplined and rising, seemed a perfect shield. For the Hohenzollerns, it was a chance to extend influence into the wealthy Low Countries. A chess move, elegant and cold. And Wilhelmine? She was the piece moved across the board. The wedding was celebrated with grandeur. Silk banners draped the streets. Bells rang across The Hague. Fireworks cracked the sky. To the public eye, it was a triumph. A bond of nations, sealed in youth and beauty. Portraits of the couple were commissioned. Engravings spread through Europe, showing them side by side, regal, composed, destined for greatness. But the portraits lied. William V, though born heir to a mighty legacy, lacked the fire that kings and leaders required. He was hesitant, slow to decide, too easily persuaded by whichever voice spoke loudest near him. Courtiers described him as kind but weak, a man of ceremony rather than command. Wilhelmine saw it quickly. She, raised in the furnace of Prussian discipline, recognized hesitation when it appeared. She, sharp and confident, possessed a clarity her husband did not. Where he lingered in doubt, she reached conclusions. Where he stumbled, she steadied. But such steadiness came at a price. From the beginning, whispers rose in the Dutch Republic. She was foreign. She was Prussian. She was ambitious. These words, once spoken, grew sharper each year. What was celebrated in Berlin as intelligence became, in The Hague, a threat. What was admired in Prussia as determination became, in Holland, arrogance. Yet in the early days, Wilhelmine bore it with resolve. She learned Dutch. She adapted to the ceremonies of the Republic. She wrote letters home with careful diplomacy, never revealing her unease. A princess must never confess loneliness. A consort must never admit fear. But fear was there. The Dutch political world was unlike Prussia. The Republic was not ruled by absolute monarchy. Power was balanced, contested, fragile. Regents and merchants, provinces and factions, all wrestled for control. It was a web, not a throne. And into this web, Wilhelmine was thrust. She tried to anchor herself through William. Yet William could not anchor even himself. At councils, he faltered. At crises, he hesitated. In those moments, Wilhelmine stepped forward, not publicly, not openly, but with words whispered in private, with directives drafted in her hand. Many decisions bore her touch before they bore her husband's seal. Observers noticed, and soon the quiet truth escaped into the streets. It was not William who ruled, but Wilhelmine. To some this was salvation, to others sacrilege. Pamphlets circulated. They painted her as a schemer, a German intruder, a woman who dared to govern in a land where women were expected to remain unseen. The Dutch prided themselves on independence, and to them she was a symbol of foreign interference, an arrogant shadow bending their stadtholder's will. But Wilhelmine did not bend. She could not. She believed, as only a daughter of Prussia could, that discipline and firmness were virtues, not sins. She pressed forward, determined to preserve her husband's authority, even if it meant carrying the weight herself. Yet marriage, even political marriage, is more than strategy. Behind the tapestries of diplomacy was a household, a husband, a wife. And in that private world, cracks widened. Wilhelmine was sharp. William was hesitant. Their temperaments clashed. There was no great passion, no fire that bound them. What existed was duty. A cold duty, one that chained them together but kept their hearts apart. She bore children as expected. She played her role at ceremonies, smiled for portraits, hosted banquets. But beneath the gold and velvet, there was silence. And in that silence, the weight of her position grew. For every smile given to the people, she received whispers of scorn. For every effort to strengthen the House of Orange, she met walls of suspicion. And for every step she took into politics, another accusation followed her, that she was not wife but ruler, not consort but tyrant. Still, she endured. Her letters from this period reveal not a broken woman, but a determined one. She wrote with precision, reporting crises, analyzing situations, demanding clarity. She believed she could carry both her husband's weakness and the Republic's instability on her shoulders. But history does not forgive so easily. A storm was gathering across Europe. Enlightenment ideas fanned rebellion. French whispers crossed borders. Dutch factions sharpened their knives. And Wilhelmine, standing tall at her husband's side, would soon find herself the target of something no royal training had prepared her for: public humiliation. For now, though, she remained the foreign princess, the shadow queen, walking corridors lined with suspicion. trying to steady a throne that trembled beneath her feet. The marriage had given her power, but it had also given her chains. And the world, watching from afar, wondered which would break first. William V of Orange was not a cruel man, but neither was he a strong one. From his youth, he had been described as gentle, indecisive, impressionable. A boy who listened too much, hesitated too long, and doubted himself even when he was right. Those qualities, harmless in a private man, became fatal in a stadtholder. The Dutch Republic was not an easy country to rule. It was a state built not on absolute monarchy, but on compromise, balance, negotiation. The provinces guarded their independence. The regents defended their privileges. The merchants demanded profit above all else. To govern such a fractious nation required shrewdness, willpower, and decisiveness. William had none. Wilhelmine saw it quickly. She, trained in the stern halls of Berlin, recognized weakness the way a soldier recognizes rust on steel. She saw his hesitation in council, his deference to louder voices, his inability to choose a path when all demanded choice. At first, she tried to guide him gently. A word whispered in private, a suggestion at supper, a draft of a letter shaped by her hand but signed by his. But the pattern deepened. The more he faltered, the more she acted. Soon, it was not guidance. It was governance. Observers began to notice. Diplomats wrote home with careful phrasing. It seems the princess has considerable influence upon her husband. Others were less delicate. It is not the stadtholder, but his wife, who holds the reins of state. In a society where women were expected to remain behind the curtain, such words were dangerous. The Dutch elite grew uneasy. They saw in Wilhelmine a foreign hand, meddling in their affairs. They saw ambition where there was necessity, arrogance where there was clarity. Every act of hers, meant to protect her husband's position, became another stone thrown at her reputation. But Wilhelmine could not stop. To her, William's weakness was a void she had to fill, or else the House of Orange would collapse. She was intelligent, sharp, unafraid of decisions. She had the clarity her husband lacked. She had the courage to act when he hesitated. And so she acted. But every step forward carved her image deeper into the minds of her enemies. The domineering wife, the shadow queen, the Prussian interloper. The irony was cruel. What saved her husband in moments of crisis damned her in the eyes of the nation. William, for his part, did not resist. He leaned on her more and more. He trusted her judgment, depended on her resolve. In private, perhaps, he even admired her strength. But admiration could not protect her from the storm outside. The people whispered, pamphlets mocked, regents muttered, and Wilhelmine, walking through gilded corridors, felt the eyes of suspicion follow her everywhere. There was another cruelty in it. She had not chosen this life. She had not asked for such power. She had been trained to accept it, shaped to wield it, forced to use it when her husband would not. And yet for this, she was despised. Her marriage, meant to bind two nations, instead bound her to a man who could not carry the weight of his office. She bore it for him. She carried it alone, but the burden grew heavier with each passing year. Behind the curtains of power, their private life was no refuge. The marriage lacked warmth. Affection was duty, not joy. Respect was strained, and love, if it had ever flickered, was smothered by politics, by disappointment, by silence. Wilhelmine endured. She poured herself into politics, into saving her husband's position, into defending the dynasty. But in that defense, she lost what little personal peace might have been hers. She became what the world feared. the woman who ruled when her husband could not, and the world punished her for it. It is easy now to blame William for weakness, to say he failed as a ruler, failed as a husband. But history is rarely so simple. He was, in many ways, a man out of place, a gentle figure in a brutal age. Perhaps he might have been happy as a scholar, a noble without responsibility. But he had been born to a legacy he could not uphold. And so, Wilhelmine became his strength, his voice, his resolve, his shield. But shields take the blows meant for others. Every insult hurled at William landed on her. Every failure of his leadership was blamed on her interference. Every rumor of foreign domination carried her name. The irony deepened into tragedy. She had more ability than her husband, more clarity than many men in power, more vision than most of those who opposed her. Yet ability in a woman was not seen as virtue, it was seen as threat. So she was trapped. To do nothing was to let her husband fall. To act was to be condemned. It was a noose, tightening with each decision, each crisis, each year of a weak husband's reign. The marriage that was meant to secure her destiny had instead secured her chains. And Wilhelmine, the steel-blooded daughter of Prussia, would discover just how sharp those chains could cut. Power, in Wilhelmina's hands, was both a weapon and a curse. She had not seized it for herself. She had picked it up where her husband dropped it, holding the reins because someone had to. Yet in the Dutch Republic, where suspicion of monarchy ran deep, her every gesture was magnified, twisted, and turned against her. She did not hide in the background. She would not. Wilhelmine attended councils, gave instructions, corresponded with foreign envoys. She spoke firmly, clearly, with the sharpness of one raised in Prussia's Iron Court. Ministers recognized her authority even when they resented it. Diplomats, writing home, often noted that it was she, not William, who set the course. But clarity is rarely welcomed when it comes from the wrong lips. In Prussia, decisiveness in a man was strength. In the Netherlands, decisiveness in a woman was arrogance. Wilhelmine's intelligence, admired in Berlin, became in The Hague the mark of an ambitious intruder. Pamphlets began to circulate. The Dutch had a long tradition of printing political satire, sharp as daggers and cheap enough to flood the streets. In those pamphlets, she was mocked as the Prussian woman, a foreigner meddling in Dutch affairs, a wife who ruled in her husband's name, steering the Republic toward her family's interests. The more she acted, the more fuel she gave them. And yet, what choice did she have? William could not lead. If she stepped back, the dynasty would fall. If she stepped forward, she would be despised. So she chose to endure the hatred. Wilhelmine believed she was serving not herself, but the House of Orange, the stability of the Republic, the survival of her children's inheritance. She faced critics with cold dignity. She refused to apologize for her strength. But strength is costly. Every insult cut, every caricature wounded, every whisper in the corridors of The Hague reminded her that she was foreign, that she would never be accepted, no matter how much she gave. It was a paradox, cruelly designed. She was both essential and expendable, resented and relied upon. A woman both inside the palace and outside the nation's trust. Her letters from this period reveal a mix of defiance and fatigue. She wrote with precision, analyzing situations with remarkable political insight. But beneath the sharp words, a shadow lingers. The loneliness of one who knows she will never be thanked. Meanwhile, the Republic grew restless. Tensions mounted between factions, between those loyal to the House of Orange and those who despised hereditary power. The Patriots, as they were called, pushed for reform, for Republican strength, for the weakening of the stadtholder's role. To them, Wilhelmine was the embodiment of everything wrong: monarchy, foreign influence, autocracy dressed in female ambition. She became a symbol, not of her choosing, not of her making, but a symbol nonetheless. Her enemies painted her as a foreign queen imposing her will. Her supporters, fewer in number, admired her for her resolve. But even they admitted that her presence made the Orange cause harder to defend. It is a bitter fate when even your loyalty harms the very cause you seek to protect. At court, she stood tall, regal, composed. But beyond the palace walls, her name was spat like venom. This was the tragedy. The more she tried to save her husband's authority, the more she eroded it. Because the people did not see a prince rescued by his wife. They saw a prince dominated, emasculated, reduced. And they despised them both for it. In the late 1780s, criticism swelled into crisis. The Patriots gained strength. Street clashes erupted. The House of Orange seemed on the verge of collapse. And in the center of it all stood Wilhelmine, accused of being the foreign hand pulling every string. She bore it with iron composure. But inside, the strain was immense. Imagine it. A woman forced into marriage for politics, forced into power by necessity, forced into hatred by circumstance. She carried a burden no one else would bear, and for it, she was reviled. The irony did not escape her. She knew she was despised. She knew pamphlets mocked her. She knew she was seen as the obstacle rather than the savior. Yet she pressed forward. To stop would be to let everything collapse. History rarely spares such figures. A man in her position might have been remembered as strong, decisive, pragmatic. She, however, was remembered as meddling, arrogant, foreign. And the criticism was not merely public. It was personal. It seeped into her household, into her marriage, into the very air she breathed. It made every step in The Hague a walk through whispers. Wilhelmine had become, by the late 1780s, a lightning rod for all the Republic's anger. She was the face of everything wrong in a system already cracking. And though she stood with steel composure, the cracks would soon widen into an earthquake. Because criticism was not the end. It was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would break upon her. By the mid-1780s, the Dutch Republic was a land in turmoil. The patriots, merchants, regents, reformers, were rising. They demanded an end to hereditary rule. They wanted the stadtholder weakened, the House of Orange pushed aside. Pamphlets multiplied. Crowds gathered in squares. The orange banner, once a symbol of unity, was now ripped down, trampled underfoot. And at the center of the storm stood Wilhelmine. She was no passive consort. She had become the face of the dynasty. The foreign woman who meddled, the shadow queen who commanded when her husband hesitated. To the patriots, she was everything they despised. To her allies, she was the last defense. The tension broke in the summer of 1787. Rebellion spread like fire. Patriot militias occupied towns, streets filled with slogans and chants. The Hague, the seat of power, grew hostile. And in June, Wilhelmine made her fateful decision. She would go there herself. It was a bold move. It was reckless. But she believed only her presence could sway hearts, restore dignity, salvage the crumbling authority of her family. So she set out by carriage. The road was lined not with cheering subjects, but with suspicion. Farmers stared coldly. Villagers muttered. She pressed forward, her carriage wheels grinding over dust and stone. She carried no army, No weapons, only her name, her dignity, her iron will. She never reached her destination. Outside the town of Gouda, Patriot forces intercepted her. They stopped the carriage. They demanded she return. Wilhelmine, proud and defiant, refused. She declared herself Princess of Orange, consort of the Stadtholder, rightful lady of the Republic. She expected respect, perhaps negotiation. Instead, she was insulted. The Patriots forced her to wait for hours, humiliated her before onlookers. They treated her not as royalty, but as an enemy. One pamphlet later mocked, "The princess learned that her crown was worth little outside the palace gates." The news spread like wildfire. Europe was shocked. A royal woman, stopped, insulted, humiliated by rebels? It was more than an affront. It was a symbol. The dignity of the House of Orange had been dragged into the mud, and Wilhelmine herself had been made a public spectacle. But humiliation did not end there. Her husband, William V, remained passive, hesitant, almost paralyzed by the unfolding chaos. He could not defend her. He could not avenge her. Once again, Wilhelmine was forced to bear the burden alone. Yet the insult gave her something she had lacked: leverage. Her cousin, Frederick William II of Prussia, seized upon the outrage. His blood boiled at the treatment of his kinswoman. An affront to her was an affront to him. And Prussia had an army. In September 1787, Prussian troops marched into the Dutch Republic. Their advance was swift, unstoppable. Patriot militias scattered. Cities fell. Within weeks, the House of Orange was restored. On the surface, it was victory. Wilhelmine returned in triumph. Crowds, now cowed, hailed the return of order. The Patriots fled or went underground. Power was once again in Orange hands. But victory carried a scar. The memory of her humiliation never faded. In private, she carried it like a wound. She had set out to save her dynasty. Instead, she had been mocked, degraded, and rescued not by her husband, but by foreign troops. And the people never forgot either. To many Dutch citizens, the return of the Oranges on the bayonets of Prussia was not restoration. It was occupation. And Wilhelmine, already hated as a foreigner, became the embodiment of that foreign domination. Her strength, her courage, her defiance, all twisted into evidence of tyranny. Pamphlets renewed their venom. Satirists mocked her failed journey. The Patriots whispered of vengeance. And though the Orange dynasty stood firm for a time, its foundations had been cracked beyond repair. Wilhelmine herself grew harder after 1787. Those who knew her described a woman both proud and wounded, determined yet marked by bitterness. She had faced her enemies and been spat upon. She had been rescued by her cousin's soldiers, not by the loyalty of her people. It was the kind of insult that does not heal. In the years to come, she would remember that journey, the halted carriage, the long hours of humiliation, the mocking eyes upon her, as the turning point. The day she learned that crowns can be stripped in an instant, that dignity can be ground into dust, that a woman's resolve, however strong, can be broken by a jeering crowd. And though the orange banner once again flew over Dutch cities, she knew in her heart that the end had only been delayed. For if a dynasty had to be saved by foreign bayonets, was it truly safe at all? The year was 1795. The French Revolution had erupted years earlier, shaking thrones across Europe. Now its armies poured across borders, carrying not only soldiers, but ideas: liberty, equality, fraternity. For the Dutch Republic, it was the end. Patriot exiles, who had once mocked and insulted Wilhelmine in 1787, now returned under French banners. Town after town fell. The Batavian Republic was declared. The House of Orange collapsed. For Wilhelmine, it was the final blow. She had endured humiliation. She had endured hatred. But now, she endured defeat. William Vesiv hesitated, as always. He delayed. He hoped for compromise. But compromise never came. The choice narrowed to one: flee or be captured. So they fled. In the bitter winter, the House of Orange abandoned their homeland. Carriages rattled over frozen roads. Possessions were hurriedly packed, jewels stuffed into cases, papers burned in haste. Behind them, centuries of power crumbled. Ahead of them lay uncertainty. England gave them refuge. The British crown, wary of France, welcomed them as symbols of resistance. Yet hospitality was not the same as home. In London, they were guests, honored but powerless. They lived in borrowed houses, received with courtesy but lacking true authority. To the British court, they were useful exiles, not sovereign rulers. Wilhelmine felt the sting. Once, she had held councils in The Hague. Once, her words had carried weight across provinces. Now she was reduced to petitions, letters, waiting for the favor of allies. And worse, she carried the memory of 1787. The insult, the jeering crowd, the humiliation. It haunted her. Even in exile, she felt its echo, proof that she was hated in the land that was supposed to call her princess. Exile hardened her. She grew colder, more rigid, more withdrawn. Friends described her as proud still, but tinged with sorrow. A woman who carried steel in her spine, but shadows in her eyes. Years passed. England remained a station, never a destination. Eventually, the family moved to Germany, to Brunswick, to Prussia. They wandered like ghosts across courts that pitied, but never restored them. Exile is not simply distance, it is erasure. In England, in Germany, in Prussia, they were outsiders. Their ceremonies were small. Their influence was gone. Their titles were empty, spoken politely but without substance. Wilhelmine knew it well. She had once been the shadow queen of the Netherlands. Now she was only a shadow. She wrote fewer letters. She appeared less in public. The once fiery presence dimmed. Yet beneath the silence, her pride remained unbroken. She never admitted defeat, even as defeat defined her existence. What is more bitter than exile? It is not merely the loss of home. It is the knowledge that home has rejected you. That when you left, no one wept. That when your banner fell, the people cheered its fall. Wilhelmine bore that truth like a stone in her chest. Her children grew in foreign courts. They lived without the authority their birth had promised. The name of Orange survived, but only as memory. And Wilhelmine, watching them, felt both fierce love and helpless despair. She had fought so hard to defend their inheritance. Now it was ashes in her hands. William Fives declined steadily. Age, weakness, hesitation, these only deepened. He remained the figurehead of a dynasty in exile. But it was Wilhelmine who carried the reality. She managed their household, their finances, their contacts with foreign courts. Once again, she took the burden her husband could not. But the burden was heavier in exile, for there was no power to be gained, only dignity to be preserved. She preserved it stubbornly. Even stripped of thrones, she held herself with royal pride. Even when mocked as irrelevant, she walked as though she still commanded armies. But inside, the silence grew louder. History can be crueler in exile than in death. A fallen monarch is remembered, an exiled one is forgotten. Wilhelmine felt that forgetting. Each year away from the Netherlands was another year erased from memory. The Patriots built their new republic. France reshaped Europe. And she, once a force of politics, once the iron will of Orange, was left to watch from afar. Exile is slow death, not of the body, but of the spirit. And Wilhelmine, though still alive, felt herself dying piece by piece. When she walked through the halls of foreign palaces, she knew she was tolerated, not respected. When she read the news from Europe, she knew her name was absent. When she looked at her husband, timid and weary, she knew she carried the weight alone. And yet, she endured. Not because she hoped to return. By then, hope had grown thin. But because endurance was all she had left. She was still a Hohenzollern, still a princess of Prussia, still Wilhelmine. Pride alone kept her from collapsing completely. But pride cannot cure loneliness. Pride cannot replace a homeland. Pride cannot silence the truth that she had been cast out, hated, and erased. The House of Orange would live again. She believed that. She prayed for that. But she also knew, deep down, that she herself would never set foot in her former home again. Exile had become her kingdom, and exile would be her prison until death. In 1806, William V of Orange died. The weak husband, the hesitant ruler, the man Wilhelmine had carried for decades, was gone. For some, widowhood brings release. For Wilhelmine, it brought only another kind of prison. She was 55, an age when many royal women retreated into quiet piety, surrounded by grandchildren and softened by years. But there was no softening for her. No palace, no throne, no triumphant role. She was a queen without a crown, a consort without a court, a widow without a home. In Brunswick, where she settled after William's death, she lived modestly. The word modest for a princess meant fewer servants, fewer banquets, fewer ceremonies. But the difference was vast. She had once presided over courts, commanded politics, dictated alliances. Now her days passed in near silence. She still dressed with care. She still held her spine straight, her chin lifted. Old habits do not fade easily. But those who saw her noticed the change. One diplomat wrote, "She has become a shadow of herself, a woman once of steel now faded, though still proud." Pride remained. But it was the pride of survival, not of triumph. Her letters from these years grew fewer. When she did write, they were practical, restrained, drained of the fire that had once fueled her. She rarely spoke of hope, rarely of return, mostly of duty to her children, of managing what was left. For she still had children, and through them, the House of Orange lived. Her eldest son, William Frederick, became the figure upon whom hopes rested. He would one day, perhaps, restore the dynasty. She loved him fiercely, yet even that love carried pain. For she could not guide him as she once had guided his father. Age, distance, exile, these weakened her grip. And when, years later, he would indeed rise as King William I of the Netherlands, Wilhelmine would not be beside him. She would be far away, a widow remembered in name but not in presence. The irony was sharp. She had carried the dynasty in its darkest hours, but she would not taste its restoration. In Brunswick, her life shrank to small rituals: reading, receiving a few visitors, walking gardens not her own, attending chapel. Day after day, the repetition of exile pressed down. Widowhood did not free her from criticism either. Rumors lingered. Pamphlets still echoed in memory. In the Netherlands, her name remained stained. Even in death, William V was pitied for weakness, but she was condemned for strength. That injustice gnawed at her. She had done what she believed necessary. She had carried her husband's failures, defended the House of Orange, endured humiliation, endured exile. Yet history, at least in her lifetime, refused to see her sacrifice as anything but arrogance. It is a cruel fate to give everything and be remembered only for what others despised. Those around her saw the toll. A lady-in-waiting once remarked, "She does not laugh. She speaks less and less, and when she does, her words fall heavy, as though drawn from a deep well of sorrow." And yet she endured, because enduring was all she had left. Widowhood also brought reflection. In private, she revisited memories of Berlin, her childhood, her training, her family. She thought of her forced marriage, her years of power, the journey to Gouda, the humiliation, the exile. She replayed it as though it were a play, every act ending in the same curtain: isolation. But memory is not mercy. Memory is a blade. Her husband's death had left her alone with those memories, and they were merciless companions. Still, she lived as though watched, straight-backed, composed, a remnant of the princess she once had been. To crumble would have been to surrender, and Wilhelmine, even in shadows, refused to surrender. Yet even pride cannot warm an empty chamber. As the years passed, the rooms around her grew quieter. Servants aged, visitors dwindled, old allies died. The world outside moved on. Napoleon rose, conquered, fell. The map of Europe shifted. Dynasties collapsed. Dynasties rose, and Wilhelmine, once at the heart of politics, watched from the margins, her name scarcely mentioned. Widowhood was not peace. It was erasure. And Wilhelmine of Prussia, once called arrogant for wielding power, was now left with nothing but silence. Her story was not finished, but already it was fading, even as she lived it. In 1806, William V of Orange died. The weak husband, the hesitant ruler, the man Wilhelmine had carried for decades, was gone. For some, widowhood brings release. For Wilhelmine, it brought only another kind of prison. She was 55, an age when many royal women retreated into quiet piety, surrounded by grandchildren and softened by years. But there was no softening for her. No palace, no throne, no triumphant role. She was a queen without a crown, a consort without a court, a widow without a home. In Brunswick, where she settled after William's death, she lived modestly. The word modest for a princess meant fewer servants, fewer banquets, fewer ceremonies. But the difference was vast. She had once presided over courts, commanded politics, dictated alliances. Now her days passed in near silence. She still dressed with care. She still held her spine straight, her chin lifted. Old habits do not fade easily. But those who saw her noticed the change. One diplomat wrote, "She has become a shadow of herself, a woman once of steel now faded, though still proud." Pride remained. But it was the pride of survival, not of triumph. Her letters from these years grew fewer. When she did write, they were practical, restrained, drained of the fire that had once fueled her. She rarely spoke of hope, rarely of return, mostly of duty to her children, of managing what was left. For she still had children, and through them, the House of Orange lived. Her eldest son, William Frederick, became the figure upon whom hopes rested. He would one day, perhaps, restore the dynasty. She loved him fiercely, yet even that love carried pain. For she could not guide him as she once had guided his father. Age, distance, exile, these weakened her grip. And when, Years later, he would indeed rise as King William I of the Netherlands. Wilhelmine would not be beside him. She would be far away, a widow remembered in name but not in presence. The irony was sharp. She had carried the dynasty in its darkest hours, but she would not taste its restoration. In Brunswick, her life shrank to small rituals: reading, receiving a few visitors, walking gardens not her own, attending chapel. Day after day, the repetition of exile pressed down. Widowhood did not free her from criticism either. Rumors lingered. Pamphlets still echoed in memory. In the Netherlands, her name remained stained. Even in death, William V was pitied for weakness, but she was condemned for strength. That injustice gnawed at her. She had done what she believed necessary. She had carried her husband's failures, defended the House of Orange, endured humiliation, endured exile. Yet history, at least in her lifetime, refused to see her sacrifice as anything but arrogance. It is a cruel fate to give everything and be remembered only for what others despised. Those around her saw the toll. A lady-in-waiting once remarked, "She does not laugh. She speaks less and less, and when she does, her words fall heavy, as though drawn from a deep well of sorrow." And yet she endured, because enduring was all she had left. Widowhood also brought reflection. In private, she revisited memories of Berlin, her childhood, her training, her family. She thought of her forced marriage, her years of power, the journey to Gouda, the humiliation, the exile. She replayed it as though it were a play, every act ending in the same curtain: isolation. But memory is not mercy. Memory is a blade. Her husband's death had left her alone with those memories, and they were merciless companions. Still, she lived as though watched, straight-backed, composed, a remnant of the princess she once had been. To crumble would have been to surrender, and Wilhelmine, even in shadows, refused to surrender. Yet even pride cannot warm an empty chamber. As the years passed, the rooms around her grew quieter. Servants aged, visitors dwindled, old allies died. The world outside moved on. Napoleon rose, conquered, fell. The map of Europe shifted. Dynasties collapsed. Dynasties rose, and Wilhelmine, once at the heart of politics, watched from the margins, her name scarcely mentioned. Widowhood was not peace. It was erasure. And Wilhelmine of Prussia, once called arrogant for wielding power, was now left with nothing but silence. Her story was not finished, but already it was fading, even as she lived it. By the final decade of her life, Wilhelmine of Prussia was no longer the fiery princess who had once faced down revolutionaries. She was an old woman, a widow, a figure displaced from the stage of history. She lived at Het Loo Palace in Apeldoorn, a residence more like a retreat than a court. The halls were quiet. The gardens, though well kept, carried the stillness of abandonment. She walked them slowly, wrapped in heavy shawls, her steps unsteady. The years of exile had drained her. The loss of power had hollowed her. And above all, the weight of memory pressed upon her like stone. She remembered Berlin, the city of her birth. She remembered her father's court, stern and cold. She remembered the day of her marriage, when the carriage carried her away forever. She remembered The Hague, the pamphlets, the whispers. She remembered the journey in 1787, the carriage stopped by rebels, the hours of humiliation. She remembered the flight in 1795, jewels packed in haste, papers burned in firelight. Her life had been one long chain of departures, and by the end, she had nowhere left to go. Doctors visited her at Het Loo. They wrote in their reports words that echoed her suffering. Melancholia profunda, a deep melancholy. Vital forces exhausted. The body intact, the spirit broken. She was not destroyed by plague, nor by war, nor by poison. She was destroyed by sorrow. Depression is not a wound that can be dressed. It is not a fever that can be cooled. It is a slow erasure of the self. Day by day, thought by thought, it eats away its strength until nothing remains. Wilhelmine withdrew more each year. She spoke less. She received fewer visitors. Even her letters dwindled, once sharp with political observation, now reduced to polite courtesies. The fire in her pen was gone. Those who did see her noticed the change. "She seems haunted," one attendant wrote. "Her eyes look not upon us, but upon things long gone." And perhaps that was true. Perhaps she was living more in memory than in present. A woman surrounded by ghosts of what had been. Her son's coronation in 1815 brought little comfort. The House of Orange was restored, but she was not restored with it. She remained absent, a mother left in the shadows while history celebrated her child. To the Dutch people, her son was a savior. To them, she remained the foreign princess who had meddled, the shadow queen best forgotten. And so, even triumph deepened her loneliness. At Het Loo, her health declined. She ate little. She slept poorly. At times, she wandered corridors at night, whispering to herself as though in conversation with the past. Servants grew worried but could do nothing. No medicine could cure what ailed her. She began to resemble the very symbol of her life. A woman of steel turned into a shadow. On June 9, 1820, Wilhelmine of Prussia died. She was 68. The official cause was decline of health, weakness of body, exhaustion of spirit. But those who knew her said otherwise. She did not die of illness. She died of sorrow, the silence of exile, the weight of humiliation, the emptiness of widowhood, the erasure from history. Each had cut her deeper than any blade. When her death was announced, there were no great ceremonies, no parades of mourning, no national grief. She passed almost quietly, as though slipping from memory the way she had slipped from power. And yet, for those who remembered, her death carried a bitter truth. Wilhelmine had once held the fate of a dynasty in her hands. She had faced mobs. She had endured exile. She had carried the burdens her husband could not. She had kept alive the Orange cause when all seemed lost. And yet she died alone, her strength remembered only as arrogance, her sacrifice mistaken for ambition, her name half erased even before she entered the grave. In that silence lies her tragedy. A crown can glitter, but it can also corrode. It can raise, but it can also ruin. It can shine upon history, yet cast its bearer into shadow. Wilhelmine of Prussia learned this truth in life, and she carried it with her into death. History is not fair. It remembers kings for their crowns. It remembers generals for their victories. But women like Wilhelmine of Prussia, who carried thrones on their shoulders, are remembered only in fragments, in whispers, in shadows. Her story is one of paradox. She was strong, yet condemned for strength. She was loyal, yet hated for loyalty. She was the force that held the House of Orange through humiliation, exile, and collapse. Yet when her son returned as king, she remained outside the celebration, a mother forgotten in her own dynasty's triumph. Her life asks a question. What is the cost of power when you are born a woman in a world that fears you? For Wilhelmine, the cost was everything. She was the steel spine behind a hesitant husband. She was the strategist who saw clearly when others stumbled. She was the shield that absorbed insults meant for a dynasty. And for this, she paid with solitude, bitterness, depression, and death. The image that remains is not of a radiant queen draped in victory. It is of a widow walking empty corridors, haunted by memories, carrying pride like armor, though her heart was long since broken. Her tragedy is not hers alone. It is the tragedy of many royal women. They were educated to serve dynasties, not themselves. Married for alliances, not for love. Used as tools, praised for their duty, but scorned if they dared to show ability. History is filled with such names. Women powerful enough to hold kingdoms together, but never powerful enough to claim freedom for themselves. Wilhelmine's death in 1820 closed one life, but it also left behind a warning. That crowns, though glittering, are heavy. That thrones, though exalted, are prisons. That power, without love, without recognition, can break even the strongest spirit. Her life proves that exile is not just physical, it is also emotional. One can live in palaces, surrounded by wealth, yet still be exiled from affection, from gratitude, from remembrance. And so, Wilhelmine of Prussia stands today, not as a queen, but as a symbol. A symbol of the silent burdens borne by women who were asked to be both strong and invisible. A symbol of the cost of dynastic politics. A symbol of how history praises men for power, but punishes women for the same. Her story lingers in shadows, waiting for those willing to look closer. Because behind every crown lies a cost. Behind every dynasty lies a sacrifice, and behind Wilhelmine's name lies a sorrow too deep to heal. She died at 68, not of disease, but of depression, and that truth should not be forgotten. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden tragedies of royalty, stories of power, sorrow, and silence erased by time, make sure to subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Together, we will bring forgotten voices back to light and remember the lives that history tried to bury in shadow. Don't let these whispers vanish forever. Hit subscribe now and walk with us into the untold tragedies of the past.